Is the existence of God self-evident? Let's consider. Hello, philosophers. I'm Chico. Welcome to the Philosopher Channel Summary of the Summa Theologica. Today we're doing Part 1, Question 2, Article 1, whether the existence of God is self-evident. And some people do believe that the existence of God is self-evident. They take it that we have some kind of innate knowledge of God already there, or that it's just obvious once you know what God is, that God must exist, something like that. That's not Aquinas' view. Aquinas' position is that the existence of God is not self-evident. He lays it out like this: no one can mentally admit the opposite of what is self-evident. So if something is self-evident, in your mind, you can't doubt it. As an example, he gives Aristotle's example of the foundations of logic. So he's thinking here of stuff like the law of non-contradiction. Now, it's interesting. The law of non-contradiction is the idea that a thing can't be both true and false at the same time and in the same way. And when you hear that, it's something that he says that mentally, you have to assent to. So you might verbally dismiss it, but mentally, when you think about it, there's no way for that to be false. There are philosophers who deny it, like Graham Priest, for example, who come up with an entire logic that is dedicated to denying the law of non-contradiction. But for Aquinas, he would say that, mentally though, there's no way that you could deny this. So no one can mentally admit the opposite of a self-evident proposition, and yet the opposite of this proposition, God exists, can be held by certain people. And he quotes Psalm 53:2 that says, "The fool hath said in his heart that there is no God." So presuming that there are, people out there that are fools that say that there is no God, and assuming that, they mentally believe it as well. So the fact that God exists is not self-evident. Otherwise, you wouldn't have people able to doubt it. Okay, here's his argument for his position. 1, a thing can be self-evident in either of two ways. It can be self-evident in itself, though not to us. And 2, it can be self-evident in itself and to us. A proposition is self-evident because the predicate is included in the essence of the subject. So for example, in the proposition, man is an animal is the predicate there, and that is contained in the concept of man. In other words, that is part of what it is to be a man. So that's, part of the essence of man. 3, so if the essence of the predicate and subject is known to everyone, then the proposition will be self-evident to everyone. And again, he's pointing out the first principles of demonstration. The first principles of demonstration, he says, are common things that everybody gets. Things like parts and whole, being and non-being, etc., etc. So for example, if I were to say a thing can't both be and not be at the same time, that is obvious just knowing what being and non-being mean. And knowing those are, that's evident to everyone what being and non-being is. But if there are some to whom the essence of the predicate and subject is unknown, then the proposition will not be self-evident to them, even if it is self-evident in itself. And he gives as support here Boethius, that there are some mental concepts self-evident only to the learned, as that incorporeal substances are not in space. So some things like that incorporeal substances are not in space, meaning like things without bodies are not in space. That is something that is only self-evident if you are learned, right? If you've actually studied metaphysics or physics or something like that. Now, God is his own existence, which will come up in the next question. His essence is his existence. So in other words, God is pure being, pure existence. So in this proposition, God exists, the predicate is the same as the subject. Existence is the same thing as God. God is pure existence. So this proposition is self-evident. The trouble is that we don't know the essence of God, so that even though that proposition might be self-evident, it's not self-evident to us. Instead, he says, the proposition needs to be demonstrated by things that are more known to us, though less known in their nature, namely by effects. So God is more knowable in his essence, but he's not more knowable to us. His effects are more knowable to us. So that's the way that we get to know God is by knowing his effects. So quick review. God exists is a self-evident proposition because God just is existence. However, that is not self-evident to us. So it's a thing that is self-evident in itself, but not to us. Now let's check out some of the objections. Objection 1. Those things are said to be self-evident to us, the knowledge of which is naturally implanted in us. So if there are things that are out there that we know just by nature, right, just naturally know, so like the first principles, then we know those things self-evidently. But John Damascene says, the knowledge of God is naturally implanted in all. So the existence of God must be self-evident, says the objection. So is this knowledge of God implanted in us? Aquinas says, kind of. His reply is that man naturally desires happiness, and what is naturally desired by man must be naturally known to him. So that thing that you just naturally desire, you kind of have to know what it is. So in that sense, the thing that you desire is, innately known by you. It just, in this sort of like, I know I want that thing kind of a sense. And that thing, he says, that makes us happy is God. God is man's beatitude, his ultimate happiness. So in this way, to know that God exists is implanted in our human nature. Now, this knowledge is either implanted in us in a general and confused way or in an absolute way. So a general and confused way, an example would be like the proposition, someone is approaching. Let's say you know this proposition and you don't know who it is, right? Let's say Peter is approaching, but you're not sure who it was. You know this proposition, someone is approaching, but in a general and confused way, not in the same way as if you knew it was Peter that was coming, right? Then you would still know this proposition, someone is approaching, but in an absolute kind of a way. Now, man is often confused about his beatitude. A lot of people think that the perfect good that gives you happiness is found in money or is found in pleasure or something like that. So they know there is something that they desire, right? There is some happiness out there, some beatitude that they desire, but they don't really know what it is. That's the way in which the knowledge of God is implanted in us. We know that there's something out there that we want. We just don't really know what that thing is right off the bat. That's something we only know, in the faith. Objection 2, a thing is self-evident which is known as soon as the terms are known. So something is self-evident if you, once you know the terms of the proposition, then you know, oh, this has got to be true. And once again, he gives the example of Aristotle and the first principles of demonstration. And he talks about parts and wholes. And once you know what a part is, right, you know what a whole is, it's just obvious that a part can't be greater than the whole. That just seems totally obvious. You can't, you don't need anybody to prove that to you. It's something you just know. Self-evident. By the word God is signified, is a sign for, that thing than which nothing greater can be conceived. All right, so this is the beginning of what is called the ontological argument for God's existence, given by St. Anselm. So Aquinas is going to use it a little bit differently here, but we'll see what it is. That which exists actually and mentally is greater than that which exists only mentally. So you think about God. What does God mean? What does that word God mean? It means the thing that you can't think of anything better than. But a thing that both exists in your mind and really exists, that's better than a thing that just exists in your mind. As soon as the word God is understood, it exists mentally. Therefore, it also exists actually. So in other words, again, since, the meaning of God is that thing which nothing greater can be thought, and you're thinking about this thing, it must exist in your mind, and in order for it to be the greater than anything that you could be thought, it must actually exist. Then this thing that you're thinking about must actually exist, must be out there. So the proposition God exists is self-evident. Again, as I said, this is an argument for the existence of God given by St. Anselm, called the Ontological Argument. Aquinas does not think it's a successful argument. He throws on Proposition 6 here, by the way, just as part of his article here, whether God's existence is self-evident or not. He thinks it's entailed by the argument that God's existence must be self-evident if this argument works. So here's his first reply to the objection. maybe not everyone who hears this word God understands it to signify something than which nothing greater than can be thought. So now remember the distinction between something that's self-evident in itself but not to us versus something that's self-evident in itself and to us. So now he's giving us an example of something that might be self-evident in itself but not self-evident to us. It might not be self-evident to us even if this argument works because we don't understand the same thing by God. So some people, he says, think that God has a body. So obviously, it's not self-evident to everybody what God means. You're going to have to do further work to show that God is that thing than which nothing greater than can be thought in order for this argument to work. And therefore, it's not going to be self-evident in itself and to us. It's just going to be self-evident in itself if this really works. But his real problem with this is that it begs the question. So let's let S stand for that thing than which nothing greater can be thought. Okay, so that's what S is. So let's assume for the argument that by God is understood S. That's what so forget that whole idea that maybe it's, somebody believes that God has a body. Pretend like everybody understands God is S. It is contained within the concept of S that S exists mentally. All right. So looking at that phrase, that thing than which nothing greater can be thought, the mental existence of that thing is contained in the concept, but it is not contained within that concept of S that it exists actually. Nowhere in that definition is the actual existence ever mentioned. Proving S exists actually presupposes there actually exists something than which nothing greater can be thought. However, this is exactly what atheists would not accept, right? They would not allow that something than which nothing greater can be thought of actually exists. So for Aquinas, this begs the question. So that's Aquinas' appraisal of the ontological argument. Rather than me actually evaluate this here, however, I'm actually going to put a video out on ontological arguments on my Existence of God playlist. So heads up for that. Objection 3. So objection 3 is going to start by showing that truth is self-evident. The existence of truth is self-evident, and then go on from there to show that God is self-evident. So whoever denies the existence of truth grants that truth does not exist. If you say that truth doesn't exist, then you're saying that truth doesn't exist. In other words, if truth does not exist, then the proposition truth does not exist is true. But if anything is true, then truth does exist. So the existence of truth is self-evident. However, God is truth. In John 14:6, it says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Therefore, God's existence is self-evident. His response to this is that the existence of truth in general is self-evident. The existence of a primal truth, however, is not self-evident. So, in other words, there is, the existence of just truth in general. Yeah, of course, that's self-evident. But the existence of a specifically undergirding primal truth, of a first truth, now that's not something that is self-evident. So, this would prove the former, but not the latter. Well, that's all I have for this article. Please let me know if you have any questions, and otherwise I'll see you in the next video. Adios.